Hey guys, tonight we're peeling back the velvet curtains of history, not the kind draped over dusty portraits in a museum, but the ones that used to hang in royal bedchambers. You're about to step into a world where kings didn't just rule from thrones. They also reigned supreme over every pleasure, indulgence, and scandal you can imagine. And probably a few you can't. And fair warning, you probably won't survive this journey without raising an eyebrow, maybe both. So loosen your jaw now, it's going to drop repeatedly tonight. Before we go any further, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure. I don't have royal guards dragging people into dungeons for not clicking buttons yet. And while you're here, drop me a comment. Where are you watching from? And what time is it? Is it 2 a.m. in Singapore, midnight in Sao Paulo? Or are you listening from a medieval stone tower somewhere? Pretending you're part of the story? I see you. Night owl. Now, dim the lights. Maybe pull up a blanket or let a fan hum softly in the background. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You move quietly through the stone corridors of a medieval castle. The air smells of old incense, damp stone, and somehow perfume. Tapestries hang heavy on the walls, embroidered with scenes of chivalry and piety. Knights kneel before maidens, saints glow in halos, but behind those woven walls, the real medieval world was anything but saintly. Tonight, you're not here for tales of battlefield heroics or kingdom-building diplomacy. No, tonight is about the kings who turned their crowns into backstage passes for pleasure. The ones who didn't just break rules, they rewrote them to suit their cravings. Some rulers made governing look like an afterthought, as if collecting mistresses and lovers was part of the royal job description. And maybe, in some eras, it was. Historians still debate whether medieval monarchs were expected to behave like moral role models, or if their excesses were simply seen as perks of the throne. After all, if you had absolute power over life and death, why stop at just one wife or one bed? You're going to meet the men who lived like that, kings who made the modern celebrity scandal look like amateur hour. Think secret tunnels leading directly to royal bedrooms. Think entire government positions created just to manage affairs of the heart, or let's be honest, affairs of the flesh. One court historian from the 14th century even complained that his king spent more time inspecting his harem than his kingdom. Priorities, right? There's a strange logic to it. Some scholars argue that the public spectacle of royal pleasure actually reinforced power. If a king could take what he wanted, land, gold, lovers, it meant he was above the rules, practically divine. His excesses weren't just tolerated, they were proof of his dominance. But there's another side to that coin. Other historians point out that too much indulgence weakened kingdoms, bankrupted treasuries, provoked revolts, or led to whispers in shadowy corners. Maybe this guy shouldn't be in charge anymore. And that's where things get interesting, because no matter how decadent a king was, his personal life always had political consequences. A mistress in the wrong faction could trigger a civil war. A scandalous marriage could reshape international alliances. Even a misplaced love letter could end up shifting the course of history. Remember, this was before texts could be deleted. Tonight, you'll visit royal courts that blurred the line between politics and passion. You'll learn about monarchs who hosted orgies in gilded halls, and kings who turned monasteries into private brothels. Yes, really. And you'll discover why. For some rulers, the bedroom was more dangerous than the battlefield. One queen in Castile reportedly refused to sleep in her chambers because the king had worn out the mattresses and not from insomnia. Historians still debate whether she meant the furniture or herself. Meanwhile, in France, King Louis XV maintained an entire estate, Parc aux Cerfs, where young women were rotated through like seasonal fruit. There was literally a schedule, and no, HR did not exist in medieval Versailles. It wasn't all roses and silk sheets, though indulgence had a price. Some kings paid for their escapades with their reputations, others lost their kingdoms, but a few managed to slip through the cracks of history, remembered not for their laws or their battles, but for what they did after hours, or during hours, since time management wasn't always their strength. Imagine it: lavish banquets ending in whispered invitations, courtiers sneaking through secret doors hidden behind tapestries, gold coins exchanged for silence. And yes, occasional paternity scandals that would make even modern tabloids blush. One king of Hungary reportedly fathered so many children out of wedlock that his court had to invent new last names just to keep track of them. But here's the catch beneath all the gossip and scandal. There's a deeper story about power, about how absolute rulers navigated their desires in a world where pleasure and politics were often the same thing. Were these kings victims of their own appetites, or were they savvy operators? Using pleasure as a political tool, historians still argue about that, and probably always will. For now, though, you're just here to listen, to drift deeper into a world where velvet curtains swayed over secret rendezvous, and every whispered rumor could topple a dynasty. So relax, take a breath, the night is young, and the royal scandals have only just begun. You venture deeper into the dark corridors of the medieval world, and tonight you find yourself in France, right in the middle of the most infamous royal bedchamber in European history. The year is 1715. Versailles glows in candlelight, but beneath the gilded ceilings, something more scandalous is brewing. You are about to meet Louis XV, the king who virtually invented state-sponsored pleasure. Louis XV was not originally the debauched king of legend. In fact, he inherited the throne as a shy 5-year-old, nicknamed Le Bien-Aimé, the beloved. But being adored is a dangerous thing when you are given absolute power before you have learned long division. When he grows up, the court expects him to follow in the footsteps of his great-grandfather Louis XIV, the Sun King, the builder of Versailles, the showman. But Louis XV has other plans. By his 30s, Louis XV had turned Versailles into more than a royal palace. It had become his personal playground. While his courtiers awaited royal decrees, the king spent his afternoons and evenings in private apartments called petits apartments, where official business took a back seat to informal pleasures. Historians still debate whether this behavior was a form of escapism. Ruling France was stressful, after all, or perhaps he simply enjoyed the kind of adoration his ministers could not provide. One of his most famous mistresses, Madame de Pompadour, was more than just a mistress. She became an important political advisor, a patron of the arts, and the manager of the king's vast network of relationships. But Pompadour fell ill, and when her romantic relationship with the king cooled, she did not give up. Instead, she orchestrated the king's love life like a royal secretary to pleasure. Think of her as the executive director of a human resources department for mistresses. And then there was Parc aux Cerfs. You may have heard of it in whispers, but tonight, you stood at its gates. Imagine a private residence just outside Versailles, hidden from public view, where young girls, sometimes as young as 14, were secretly brought in to entertain the king. Official records said they were dress girls or music students. But everyone knew what was going on. There was even a secret tunnel connecting the park to the palace, so the king could avoid scandalous encounters with ministers. No need for awkward elevator rides when there was a secret passage. The logistics of this were astonishing. Women in the country were rotated regularly to avoid emotional or political entanglements. When pregnant, and they often were, the king arranged dowries or marriages to keep the matter private. And babies. They were often sent to convents or foster homes, with discreet financial support. Some historians believe that Louis XV was trying to relive his youth, trapped in a world of extravagant pleasures. Others believe that he was avoiding political responsibilities that he found overwhelming. Whatever the case, the French king spent much of his reign not in the council chamber but in his bedroom. And it wasn't just Parc aux Cerfs. Louis XV was also fond of masquerade balls, private casinos, and late-night hunting parties that ended in accidental sleepovers. There is a story about how one night he hosted a dinner party, and after dessert, each guest was assigned a secret room, complete with champagne and guests. Think of it as an 18th century version of The Bachelor, except without the cameras and no exclusions. Of course, not everyone approved. Religious leaders condemned the king's behavior. Ministers worried about political instability. Even his courtiers were whispering behind their fans about the king's weakness for silk and lace. But no one dared to stop him. Why? Because in the French monarchy, the king was the state. Technically, what he did in private was no one's business. Yet, ironically, everyone considered it their business. There is still much debate today about whether Louis XV's obsession with pleasure contributed to the downfall of the French monarchy. Did his extravagant indulgences undermine royal authority? Did the public become cynical about royal power when they learned that their king was more interested in sex than policy? Some historians say yes. Others say the regime was already crumbling, and that Louis XV's dalliances were a symptom, not a cause. But imagine this scene: Versailles glittering under chandeliers, while behind closed doors the king was immersed in a world of sensual fantasy. You could almost hear the rustle of silk dresses, the popping of champagne corks, the hushed conversations just out of earshot. Intoxicating, right, and a little sad. By the end of his life, Louis XV had outlived his mistresses, his ministers, and even his reputation. The beloved had become the infamous. He died in 1774, leaving behind debts, political turmoil, and a nephew, Louis XVI, who was eventually beheaded on the guillotine. Historians still wonder if Louis XV had spent more time on the throne and less time on the pleasures. Would the French Revolution have been delayed? Or would the fall of the monarchy have been inevitable? As you leave the Grand Hall of Versailles tonight, you can't help but hear the echo of silk slippers on the marble floors. The chandeliers still sparkle, the tapestries still hang, but behind the beauty, a warning whispers power and pleasure, when mixed recklessly, often lead to disaster. You step away from France, but not to the whispers. Tonight, you'll quietly enter another royal palace, this time in medieval England. The air smells of damp stone, flickering torches, and scandal because you're about to meet King Edward II, a king whose reign was so marred by personal depravity and political chaos that historians still argue about where to begin. Edward II ascended the throne in 1307, inheriting the kingdom from his father. Edward Vert, the Scots hammer-wielding, warrior king, castle builder, and basically the kind of guy you don't want to disappoint. But Edward II wasn't his father. While Edward the Wise spent his time expanding the empire, Edward II, well, he spent his time in bed, sometimes with queens, sometimes with favored men, sometimes with people who shouldn't have been there. From the moment he ascended the throne, Edward II ignored conventional expectations. He had no interest in military strategy, nor was he particularly interested in the governance of the kingdom. The man he loved, truly loved, was his close companion Piers Gaveston, a charismatic knight of commoner birth. Gaveston was more than a friend, he was Edward's obsession. The two were inseparable. Edward bestowed upon Gaveston many titles, jewels, and lands, and made him Earl of Cornwall, a title usually reserved for the king's son or heir. This did not sit well with the English barons, who muttered into their wine that the king was wasting the wealth of the kingdom on a gallant. Some chroniclers even accuse Edward and Gaveston of behaving like husband and wife. Was it a romance or was it politics? Historians still debate. The truth is, no one knows exactly what happened behind the scenes, but the rumors were loud enough to shake the throne. Imagine a medieval court knights in armor gnashing their teeth while Edward and Gaveston threw lavish banquets. Gaveston mocked the lords, giving them nicknames like the Black Dog of Arden and the Whore of Warwick. Now you can picture the scene: a royal banquet turned into a medieval comedy show. Except the people being mocked were the controlled army. This was more than a rumor. It was dangerous. The barons, disgusted by Gaveston's influence, forced Edward to exile him more than once. But Edward always brought him back. In 1312, things went south. The nobles seized Gaveston and, in a particularly unsubtle power play, murdered him. Not by duel, not by legal trial. They simply stabbed him with a sword on the side of a country road. Edward's grief was legendary. He publicly mourned Gaveston, vowing revenge on his favorite's killers. But instead of uniting the kingdom, his obsession with personal relationships tore it apart. The next scandal came Hugh Despenser the Younger, another favorite who filled the void left by Gaveston. Despenser was greedy, ruthless, and politically ambitious, a dangerous combination. Together, Edward and Despenser formed a royal power couple that made the barons' blood boil. Despenser used his close relationship with the king to seize land, punish his rivals, and expand his influence across England and Wales. This time, the backlash was worse. The nobles revolted, led by Edward's own wife, Queen Isabella of France. She wasn't just angry at the Despensers. She was angry at being marginalized and, frankly, humiliated. Isabella eventually allied with her lover, Roger Mortimer, and launched an invasion of England in 1326. Imagine the queen storming the kingdom she had previously only graced with her presence. A true medieval plot twist. Edward II fled, but was eventually captured. He was forced to abdicate in favor of his younger son, Edward III, and spent the rest of his days in captivity. And this is where things get murkier. According to some historians, Edward was murdered in 1327 in one of the most notorious ways imaginable by having a red-hot iron plunged into his body from a particularly uncomfortable position. Why? Because it left no visible wound, but instead sent a powerful, symbolic message. This is what happens to kings who confuse personal pleasure with political power. Historians still debate whether the gruesome detail is true or just medieval propaganda. Some say Edward died quietly in prison. Others believe he escaped and lived his life in secret. There is even a theory that he became a hermit in Italy. The mystery remains. But what is clear is that the reign of Edward II is remembered not for power, but for gossip. He was a king who blurred the line between personal desire and public duty, and in doing so, he brought about his own downfall. The court he built became a theater of favoritism, scandal, and betrayal. But it is worth noting that it was not just about personal relationships. Edward II's reign highlighted the dangers of unchecked concentrated power. When a ruler chooses his favorites over his ministers, personal pleasure over politics, and intimacy over diplomacy, it creates a vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so do ambitious barons. As you lie down tonight, gaze at the cold stone walls of Edward's castle, echoing with laughter, music, and whispered conversations. Behind the velvet curtains, behind the glittering jewels, there is always a shadow. Kings may reign, but lust rules. You've left the cold stone palaces of Edward II, but not the royal debauchery. Tonight's journey takes you east, across the Alps, into the sumptuous, candlelit chambers of Renaissance Italy. A place where the arts flourished, the sciences flourished, and, well, popes and princes did things that would put even Edward to shame. Because no list of depraved rulers would be complete without mentioning the Borgias, yes. Popes count? In the late 1400s, you find yourself standing in the heart of Rome, the center of Christianity. But the Rome you're imagining isn't the holy city of solemn prayer and quiet monasteries. This Rome reeks of wine, sweat, incense, and scandal. Here, cardinals hold parties that last for days. Here, aristocrats paid fresco painters by day and hired sex partners by night. And above all, Rodrigo Borgia, who would become Pope Alexander VI, the most notoriously depraved pope in medieval history. Rodrigo didn't stumble into the papacy, he bought it. Through massive bribes, political alliances, and sheer charisma, he secured his election in 1492. You might recognize the year. Columbus set sail, and meanwhile, the Vatican turned red with the Borgia coat of arms. Once he became pope, Rodrigo treated the office as a private business empire. He openly fathered many children, even though technically popes were not allowed to have children. His favorite mistress was Vanosa de Catanei, with whom he had 4 Cesare, Lucrezia, Juan, and Geoffrey. He then moved on to a younger lover, Giulia Farnese, nicknamed Giulia la Bella, who was so famous for her beauty that she was described as the Virgin Mary and who was also the Pope's girlfriend. A wonderful combination. Historians still debate whether Rodrigo's relationship with Giulia was based on love, convenience, or political leverage. But one thing is certain, his lust for power and pleasure was legendary. The Pope's orgies were rumored throughout Europe. One party, later known as the Chestnut Banquet, reportedly involved 50 courtesans, enormous amounts of food, and competitions you wouldn't find in Sunday school. The winner, well, let's just say it wasn't the person who could recite the most psalms. But Pope Alexander VI wasn't just interested in personal pleasure. He also wanted to consolidate his family's power. He placed his children in influential positions, regardless of church or public opinion. For example, his son Cesare was made a cardinal at the age of 18, not out of piety, but out of politics. Cesare was ruthless, intelligent, and eventually left the church to become a warlord, a sort of Renaissance James Bond villain with higher cheekbones. Then there was Lucrezia Borgia, perhaps Rodrigo's most famous child. Depending on which story you believe, she was either a cunning political strategist, a victim of family ambition, or a poisoner with rings filled with deadly powder. Some stories say she had incestuous relationships with her father and brother. Are these stories true? Scholars debate. Some believe these rumors were spread by the Borgia's enemies, who wanted to paint them as the ultimate Renaissance villains. Others claim there is some truth to it, though it may have been exaggerated over time, as any rumor has. What we do know is that Lucrezia's life was filled with political marriages, sudden widowhoods, and suspicious deaths. Her first husband, Giovanni Sforza, was accused of being impotent, a charge possibly concocted by her own family when they decided he was no longer useful. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, died. Some say she was strangled on Cesare's orders. Again, it's hard to prove, but you could almost hear the whispers in the hallways. Meanwhile, Rodrigo continued his papacy with relentless greed and lust. He sold church offices to the highest bidder, an act known as simony. Want to be a bishop? Hide a bag of gold under the table. Need a papal dispensation for something questionable? The Pope was willing to oblige. And all the while, Rome oscillated between religious center and pleasure palace. You left the velvety darkness of Rome behind, but the trail of royal misdeeds has not ended. Now you travel north, into the cold, misty lands of Eastern Europe, where the line between ruler and tyrant is as blurred as the mist on a frozen lake. If the Borgias were the masters of scandalous seduction, then Vlad III of Wallachia, also known as Vlad the Impaler, was the king of cruelty. You've heard that nickname before, right? Vlad the Impaler. It sounds like a horror movie villain, and honestly, it's not far off. But tonight, as you crawl deeper under the covers, you'll hear a quieter, stranger side to the story. This story isn't all about dangerous games and gore. It's about a man obsessed with control, punishment, and some surprisingly strange personal habits. It was the mid-1400s, and Wallachia, part of present-day Romania, was a political flashpoint. Vlad was born into turmoil. His father, Vlad II, was a member of a secret society called the Order of the Dragon, sworn to protect Christianity from the Ottoman Turks. Sounds noble. Right, except protection in this context often meant assassination, shifting alliances, and brutally enforcing allegiances. Vlad III learned early on that power came at a price. As a child, he was sent to the Ottoman Empire as a political hostage. Historians still debate whether this was a diplomatic gesture or a veiled threat. Either way, imagine yourself as a child held captive in a foreign court, knowing that your life depended on domestic politics. You'd develop some, let's call them interesting coping mechanisms. When Vlad finally returned to Wallachia, he had no interest in being nice. He had been crowned several times. His reign was interrupted by treachery, war, and traitorous nobles. But when he did, he ruled with an iron fist and a wooden stake. The method of execution he was most famous for wasn't just a punishment, it was a message. In case you're curious, and you probably are, since you're still here, impalement wasn't exactly a quick death. A sharp stake was driven into the body, usually through the bottom and out through the mouth or shoulders, and the victim was left to slide slowly under his own weight. It could take hours, sometimes days, to die. Vlad used this method not only on criminals, but also on political opponents, merchants he disliked, and sometimes entire townspeople. But this is where things get weirder. According to some historians, Vlad did more than just impalement to enforce justice. He decorated his palace with forests of impaled corpses. Visitors have reported seeing thousands of impaled corpses lined up like grotesque sculptures. In one famous story, Vlad is said to have invited local nobles to a grand banquet. While they were eating, he casually asked them how many kings they had betrayed before him. When they answered nervously, he had them all impaled right there, still warm from wine and roast lamb. It was a mood killer. Yet despite all this cruelty, Vlad was still praised by his people. Why? Because he enforced order. It was rumored that under his rule, the roads of Wallachia were so safe that a golden cup could be placed by a well without fear of being stolen. He may have been cruel, but he was fair at least by the standards of medieval rulers, which, let's be honest, weren't very high. Vlad's obsession with punishment, however, took a bizarre turn. Some reports say he dined among impaled corpses, dipping his bread in their blood. Was that true? Maybe, maybe not. Historians still debate this. Maybe it was enemy propaganda from the Saxons, who hated him. Or maybe it was true, because Vlad really didn't think like other people. He once punished a woman for being too slow at sewing by cutting off her hand and boiling her body alive in his own cauldron. He called it justice. You can call it something else. There are also legends of visiting envoys refusing to remove their hats when they met him. Vlad, always the problem solver, nailed their hats to their skulls so they would never forget their courtesy. No need to send thank you notes after that meeting. Despite all this, Vlad was not despised by everyone. In fact, he became a folk hero in some parts of Romania. To them, he was a ruler who stood up to corruption, defended the poor, and fought against the Ottomans. His cruelty was seen as necessary in a lawless age. He was like a medieval Batman, if Batman stabbed people and decorated his Batcave with their corpses. Over time, his reputation became intertwined with legend. Bram Stoker's Dracula was inspired, at least in part, by Vlad's nickname Dracula, meaning son of the dragon. But vampire lore leaves out a lot of details. There is no record of Vlad drinking blood to sustain himself. He simply enjoyed watching people die. Sleep tight. The story of Vlad the Impaler leaves historians with lingering questions. Was he a sadist? A patriot? Both? Or was he simply a product of his time? When fear was as common a tool of governance as taxes, you will have to decide for yourself. As you embark on the next part of your journey tonight, remember not all monsters live in castles at night. Some of them sit on thrones by day, clad in royal robes, issuing decrees with steady hands and colder hearts. Now, your eyes are still half closed, but you're still following a trail of royal scandals. From the chilly mountains of Wallachia to the luscious, perfumed palaces of France. And oh, France had plenty of kings who mixed power with pleasure in ways that would make modern tabloid editors blush. Tonight, let's go back to the days of Charles II of Navarre, also known as Charles the Bad. Yes, that was his nickname. No PR team tried to fix it. He wasn't Charles the Bold or Charles the Wise, just Charles the Bad. And honestly, he deserved it. Charles reigned in the mid-1300s, when Europe was still reeling from the Black Death. You might think that a global pandemic would encourage rulers to become more spiritual, more reflective. Charles went in the opposite direction. While his subjects were coughing in the streets, Charles was busy plotting, poisoning, and, well, entertaining himself. Unlike Vlad, who reveled in cruelty, Charles loved manipulation. His hobby wasn't impalement, it was betrayal. He was the kind of ruler who would shake your hand with one palm and drop a vial of poison into your drink with the other. There's a reason he's sometimes called Machiavelli's Prince Charming, centuries before Machiavelli himself was born. But Charles wasn't just politically dangerous. He was personally dangerous, too. His personal life was rife with scandal, intrigue, and according to some accounts, perverse desires. Rumors of the time suggested that he enjoyed more than the usual royal pleasures. Some say he secretly maintained a family of women, rotating mistresses the way a modern influencer rotates brand deals. Others believe he experimented with potions not only to kill his enemies but also to enhance his own vitality. Historians are still debating whether Charles was actually involved in alchemy for lustful purposes or if it was just a smear campaign. But given his reputation for mixing potions and tinkering with chemicals, it's not impossible. Medieval kings often consulted alchemists, and Charles had a private laboratory filled with strange powders, herbs, and potions. Was he making an elixir of life or a potion of desire? Probably both. Probably. And then there's how he died, which, frankly, is one of the strangest royal deaths in history. In 1387, Charles was old and frail. He was bedridden, wrapped in linen bandages soaked in brandy to ease his pain. Some historians believe this was an early medical treatment. Others suspect it was just an excuse to soak him in wine one last time. One cold winter night, as his servants prepared to wrap him in another brandy-soaked bandage, the worst happened. The servant accidentally dropped a candle onto the bandage. You can guess what happened next. Charles the Bad burst into flames like a medieval flambe. He died screaming, his flesh cracking like a roast pig. Was it an accident, maybe? Or maybe, as legend has it, it was karma finally paying off. Some say the devil himself lit the fire, punishing Charles for his lifetime of deceit and depravity. But even after his death, Charles the Bad has puzzled historians. Was he truly as evil as historians claim, or was he merely a victim of rumors? After all, most of what we know about him comes from his enemies, who had every reason to portray him as a monster. Still, his record speaks for itself, stabbing allies in the back, poisoning opponents, and living a life of luxury while his kingdom starved. One thing is certain, Charles knew the game of power. He once declared that he could rule better through fear than love, and he stuck to that policy to the end. But his personal desires, whether for poison, lovers, or both, have also become part of his legend. Remember, medieval kings were more than political figures. They were cultural icons, the objects of rumor that spread faster than any official decree. And in an age when literacy was scarce and gossip was gold, a king's bedroom was often as important as his battlefield. So as you sink deeper into this dark stroll through history, keep this in mind: the crown doesn't always rest on the noblest of brows. Sometimes it rests on the head of a man soaking in brandy, calculating his next move, even if that move involves running straight into the fire. And somewhere, in the darkness, the ghost of evil Charles is probably still smiling, because at last, he got exactly what he wanted to be remembered. Now, you might be wondering if every medieval king has a story that's as dramatic as that. Now let's move on to Naples, where the weather is warmer, but the politics are just as deadly. The king you're about to meet is King Ferdinand IV of Naples, known to his friends as Ferrante. Although friends might be a bit of a stretch, Ferrante isn't exactly the kind of guy you'd invite over for lasagna. Ferdinand ruled during the 15th century, the height of the Italian Renaissance. You'd think that would make him a patron of the arts, a lover of beauty, a learned gentleman who strolled through marble halls and recited Latin. And to be fair, he did all of those things. But he also had a strange, disturbing hobby that even other Renaissance kings, many of whom weren't saints, whispered about him. Ferrante collected corpses. Not figuratively, like a warlord counting his victories. No, he actually collected the mummies of his enemies. He embalmed them and dressed them up, posing them as if they were still alive. Then he kept them in a special underground room, like the creepiest VIP lounge you could imagine. Imagine this for a moment: you're a nobleman in Naples, plotting a rebellion against the king. Of course, you get caught, because Ferrante has spies everywhere. You're thrown in jail, tried in a kangaroo court, and executed. But that's not the end of it. Oh no. Ferrante has your body taken away, preserved by his own embalmers, and then displays you in his secret collection of political corpses. Why historians still argue about that? Some say it was a scare tactic, a way to intimidate his enemies. Others say it was a bizarre form of trophy keeping, or perhaps, deep down, Ferrante just enjoyed the company of those who couldn't fight back. According to historian Pontano, Ferrante would sometimes take visitors down to see his macabre collection, pointing out each mummy by name. "That one tried to betray me," he would whisper, pointing to a silk-wrapped corpse. "This one conspired with the French." He smiled, like a chef showing off his wine cellar, except instead of bottles, there were corpses. You might think this is an exaggerated legend. After all, medieval tales often get embellished over time. But many contemporary sources mention Ferrante's so-called Museum of Death, and given his reputation for cruelty, most historians believe that was at least partly true. What's even stranger is that Ferrante didn't see himself as a villain. In his mind, he was a restorer of order, a defender of his dynasty. But he also had a passion for theater, and this was his ultimate performance. Political punishment became performance art. And his depravity didn't stop at embalming. Ferrante was obsessed with controlling not just his court, but his entire image. He staged public spectacles that combined execution and spectacle, turning punishment into entertainment. If someone betrayed him, people wouldn't just hear about it, they'd see it firsthand, like a medieval Netflix special. He understood the psychology of fear. When you're afraid of death, you might hesitate to rebel, but when you know that your embalmed body will be dressed and displayed like a grotesque puppet for generations to come, that's a whole new level of horror. Ferrante ruled Naples for more than 30 years, and he was surprisingly successful in maintaining his power. Too successful, perhaps. When he died in 1494, his enemies were so terrified that they stopped celebrating. They almost expected his corpse to rise from the grave and continue ruling from beyond. And honestly, you can't blame them. Historians are still debating whether Ferrante's collection of corpses was a real chamber of horrors or just a metaphor that got out of control. But whether these mummies exist in silk robes or are just legends, the message is clear: betray the king, and you won't just lose your life, you'll become part of his private art gallery. So tonight, as you lie under the covers, take a peek in your closet to make sure there aren't any royal mummies staring back at you. After all, kings like Ferrante don't just want your obedience, they want your soul, your legacy, and in some cases your embalmed body, draped in their finest robes. By now, you're probably starting to realize that medieval royalty had a long list of oddities. Collecting mummies? Check. Turning political enemies into home decor? Check. But if you thought Ferrante's collection of corpses was the height of royal weirdness, you're in for a surprise. Let's switch gears to France, where kings not only conquered lands but also collected lovers, like some people collect Pokemon cards. And perhaps no one exemplified this more than King Charles VI, also known as Charles the Madman. You might be thinking, wait, wasn't Charles VI the guy who thought he was made of glass? Yes, exactly. But his glass delusions were only part of his complicated background. Charles ruled France in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, a time when Europe was still reeling from the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. It was also a time when royal behavior was, let's say, unregulated. Kings could do whatever they wanted, as long as they kept the church somewhat happy and the nobility only slightly angry. For Charles, this freedom became a playground for his mind and desires. Let's start the story. You're in Paris, 1393. The royal family is preparing for a masquerade ball to celebrate the wedding of a noblewoman. Sounds harmless enough, right? Masks, dancing, some spiced wine. But then Charles decides to liven things up with something called the Bal des Ardents, the dance of the burning men. It goes like this. Charles and a few friends dress up as wild men of the woods, a fictional medieval figure covered in fur and leaves. But not ordinary furs. These costumes were made from pine-infused linen, essentially turning the king and his cronies into walking candles. At first, the spectacle delighted the crowd. Drums pounded, dancers danced, and people laughed. But then someone, perhaps drunk on Bordeaux, carried a torch too close. The dome of fire ignited, and within seconds the dance turned into a nightmare. Flames erupted, people screamed, 4 dancers were burned alive on the spot. Charles survived, but only by a hair's breadth. His clothes smoldered, his hair singed, and his mind shattered. Some historians believe this was the moment his madness truly broke. From then on, his life and his court spiraled into a series of bizarre episodes. At times, Charles refused to bathe or change his clothes for weeks. At others, he ran screaming through the palace corridors, claiming that he was being pursued by invisible enemies. He forgot the names of his own children. He forgot that he was king. He sat silently for hours, staring into space, his hands shaking. But his most famous delusion was that he believed he was made of glass. Literally. He ordered his tailors to sew iron bars into his clothes to prevent them from shattering. He forbade anyone to touch him, fearing that a handshake would break his ribs like a wine glass. He would sit motionless for hours at a time, not moving a finger, convinced that any sudden movement would shatter his body into pieces. Now, you might wonder, was all this madness, or a reaction to the immense pressures of kingship? Historians are still debating this. Some believe Charles suffered from schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Others suggest he suffered a series of psychotic episodes, brought on by stress and genetics after all. His family tree is more loopy than a medieval tapestry. But even in his madness, Charles still sought to satisfy his desires. Despite his glass delusions, he maintained a rotating cast of royal lovers. Court records show that he sometimes summoned a retinue of courtesans, viewing the gatherings as a form of therapy. Imagine the scene: a man who believed he could shatter like a crystal vase, yet still threw all-night parties where the wine flowed, the music played, and personal boundaries dissolved. His queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, often acted as regent during his ups and downs, balancing matters of state while Charles drifted off into reality. Meanwhile, his rivals and relatives circled around him like vultures, exploiting his instability to gain more power for themselves. The French people, already burdened by war and heavy taxes, began to whisper that perhaps the king's mind wasn't the only thing that was broken. The kingdom was falling apart, too. Some said God was punishing the monarchy for its corruption. Others suggested that magic was to blame. In a way, it was both a political crisis and a medieval tabloid scandal. Even after Charles's death in 1422, the legend of his glass illusion lived on. Writers, poets, and philosophers have invoked it for centuries, holding him up as a symbol of fragile leadership and the dangers of unchecked power. Some even say his reign helped pave the way for the rise of Joan of Arc France, so desperate for salvation that it listened to a teenage peasant girl who claimed to hear voices. Tonight, as you lie on your pillow, imagine Charles in his glass-lined robe, pacing the candlelit room, afraid of a crack that might never come. Imagine yourself surrounded by gold and velvet, but trapped inside your own mind. It makes you wonder, was he truly mad, or just one of history's most tragic symbols of weakness? And maybe, just maybe, that glassy skin was a metaphor all along. At this point, you're probably thinking, well, at least Charles VI had a point. He thought he was made of glass. That's true, but not all royal eccentricities stem from neurasthenia. Some kings, they just like to scandalize, on purpose. Let's talk about France a little more, because apparently the French court had a seasonal license for debauchery. This time, we're talking about King Philip I of France, also known as Philip the Amorous. That wasn't an official title, but let's be real, it might as well have been. Philip reigned from 1060 to 1108, long before Charles VI. His reign technically took place during the First Crusade. You know, knights in shining armor, Jerusalem, piety, all that. But while the knights were storming castles and trying not to die of dysentery, Philip had other priorities. You see, Philip had a bit of an emotional problem. By problem, I mean he loved women, other people's women, to be exact. He made no secret of it, either. Imagine you're a nobleman in the 11th century. You spend years building alliances, arranging a clever political marriage, and finally, you marry a noblewoman. You throw a big party, invite the king, and, well, congratulations. Philip has now decided your wife is his new girlfriend. In 1092, Philip caused a scandal of epic proportions by setting his sights on Bertrade de Montfort. What was the catch? Bertrade was married to Fulk, Count of Anjou. Fulk, by the way, was not someone you wanted to mess with. He had a violent temper and a record of imprisoning relatives when they bothered him. But Philip didn't care. He just said, "Fulk, your wife is wonderful. I will love her forever." And he did. Philip publicly chose Bertrade as his queen, despite the small fact that they were both married to other people. The Catholic Church was not thrilled. In fact, they were horrified. The Archbishop of Reims called it bigamy. The Pope called it adultery. Philip called it love. The result? Excommunication. Not once, not twice, 3 times. That's right, Philip was excommunicated 3 separate times for this. And each time he refused to give up Bertrade. It was like being banned from a club, but he kept showing up, dancing on tables like nothing had happened. Eventually, the church got tired of playing whack-a-mole with Philip's affairs and tried to reach an agreement. He agreed to repent, but kept Bertrade. Historians still debate whether he truly reconciled with the church or just pretended. Some historians believe he promised to stay away from her while still living in the same palace, of course. And what about Bertrade? Well, she's not exactly a passive character in this play. According to medieval legend, which, let's be honest, is the best kind of legend, she was a master manipulator. She was accused of experimenting with potions, love potions, and even poison to maintain her position at the royal court. Some historians even accused her of witchcraft, a common medieval way of saying, "This woman is too powerful, and we don't like it." There's even a legend that she tried to arrange for Philip's son, Louis, to be assassinated so that her children could inherit the throne. Did that actually happen? No one knows. Historians still debate whether this was true or just a slander concocted by her political opponents. What we do know is that Bertrade remained queen until Philip died in 1108. She outlived him, retreated to a monastery, and because medieval Europe was like that, she kept her influence behind the scenes. Some say she even counseled her husband's stepson Louis VI after Philip died. Others say she poisoned him, but at that point medieval historians were writing soap operas. Meanwhile, Philip's legacy as king becomes a little complicated. Sure, he expanded the royal domain. Sure, he stabilized parts of France, but ask anyone from his time, and they'd probably say, "Oh, Philip. That guy who stole other people's wives and was excommunicated 3 times?" In medieval Europe, kings were supposed to be models of Christian virtue, but Philip decided to become a model of relentless romantic chaos. Some scholars say he was simply following his heart. Others say he was testing how much power a king could get away with before the church really imposed consequences. Spoiler alert in Philip's case, the answer is a lot. Today, historians still debate whether his reign was a failure, a moral collapse, or simply an example of royal prerogative taken to ridiculous extremes. But one thing is certain, when it comes to medieval kings behaving badly, Philip Thar set the gold standard. So, as you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine the French royal family not as a stately place of reign, but as an ongoing episode of medieval reality TV. Intrigue, scandal, and a love triangle that could last a season. And remember back then, you didn't need Netflix. You just needed a king like Philip. Are you still with me? Good, because now we're moving from France to England. And trust me, the scandal is about to hit the roof. If you thought, Philip, I was brazen, wait until you meet King Edward II. The man didn't just shatter medieval royal expectations. He threw them out the window of his castle and watched them crumble. Edward II ruled England from 1307 to 1327, and from the moment he was crowned, people started whispering. You see, Edward had unusual interests for a king. While most kings spent their time hunting, jousting, or planning wars, Edward loved digging ditches. Yes, really. He spent hours helping ordinary laborers dig drainage canals and got annoyed when his advisors told him to stop. But digging ditches wasn't scandalous. It was just weird. The real controversy comes from his personal life. Edward II had a favorite companion named Piers Gaveston. And when I say favorite, I don't mean, oh, they played chess together. I mean, Edward was obsessed with Gaveston. He showered Gaveston with gifts, titles, lands, essentially turning his best friend into the most powerful man in England overnight. It didn't matter that Gaveston wasn't of noble birth. Edward made him Earl of Cornwall, one of the richest titles in the kingdom, and even arranged for Gaveston to marry into the royal family. This didn't sit well with the other nobles. Imagine being a medieval baron, and you spent decades climbing the feudal ladder, only to see the king hand everything over to your bedfellow. Rumors spread. Was it friendship or love or something more? Historians still debate this. Some believe Edward and Gaveston were lovers, pointing to poems and letters from the time that described their relationship as closer than brothers. Others say they were just unusually close friends, but even at best, Edward's favoritism was political suicide. At his coronation in 1308, Edward made a huge mistake. He paid more attention to Gaveston than to his wife, Queen Isabella of France. That's right, Isabella herself, who would later be known as the She-Wolf of France. Spoiler alert, she didn't take it lightly. The nobility revolted. They demanded that Edward banish Gaveston, and for a while, he did. But like a lovesick teenager, Edward kept bringing him back. Gaveston was exiled for a month, then smuggled back to England the next. It was a royal game of hide and seek, and it didn't end well. Finally, the barons had had enough. In 1312, they arrested Gaveston, staged a sham trial, and executed him without Edward's permission. The king was devastated. He donned mourning clothes, locked himself in his room, and fasted for days. But Edward's troubles didn't stop there. After Gaveston's death, he found new friends. Hugh Despenser the Younger appeared, a man even more hated than Gaveston. Despenser wasn't just a close companion, he was greedy, ruthless, and made enemies wherever he went. He blackmailed nobles, imprisoned his opponents, and acted as if he owned the kingdom. Of course, Edward loved him for it. By 1321, England was in chaos. Rebellions broke out, nobles were executed or exiled, and Queen Isabella was at her wits' end. In 1325, Edward sent her on a diplomatic mission to France. A big mistake. Isabella met Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron in exile, and together they plotted a final betrayal. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer returned to England not as diplomats, but as conquerors. They led an army against Edward. forcing him to flee with Despenser. But the plan failed. Despenser was captured, tried for treason, and executed in a manner so gruesome that we won't go into the details here. It's safe to say that medieval England was anything but subtle. Edward was imprisoned, forced to abdicate in favor of his son, and finally met a mysterious death at Berkeley Castle. Some accounts say he was brutally murdered with a red-hot poker. Others say he died of illness. Historians still debate whether it was an assassination natural causes or did he actually escape and live out the rest of his life in secret. The mystery remains, but one thing is clear, Edward II's reign was a classic case study in royal incompetence. He is remembered not for his military conquests or political reforms, but for his scandals, favoritism, and inability to balance love and power. His story is often portrayed as a tragedy, a king torn between his personal passions and the crushing weight of medieval expectations, but it is also a cautionary tale. Back then, kings were more than just rulers. They were symbols. Kingdoms need them to be stable, predictable, and above all, in control. Edward. He was none of those things. He followed his heart, and in doing so, he lost his throne. And as you drift off to sleep tonight, imagine the medieval court not as a place of chivalry and splendor, but as a complex web of personal tragedies, whispered rumors, and dangerous favorites. Sometimes, history isn't about the battles, it's about the people sitting next to you at dinner. Now, while the story of Edward II is filled with drama, betrayal, and rumored scandal, the next king on our bedtime story takes royal decadence to a whole new level. Meet Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, also known as the Idle King. But don't let that nickname fool you. This guy wasn't just lazy. He was an artist of misdeeds, a true connoisseur of royal debauchery. You may be familiar with the name Wenceslaus from the Christmas carol, Good King Wenceslas. Oh, and spoiler alert, that's not Wenceslaus. The Wenceslaus in the carol was a pious duke from centuries ago, Wenceslaus IV. He was, let's just say, less interested in feeding the poor and more interested in feeding his own vices. He ruled Bohemia from 1378 to 1419, and if you happened to walk into his court during those years, you would probably see a scene straight out of a medieval banquet, except with crowns, bishops, and maybe a few tigers. Wenceslaus loved wine, so much, in fact, that he reportedly started drinking it with breakfast. Some historians claim that he couldn't attend a council meeting without a glass of wine in his hand, and he would often skip meetings to binge all day. Now, you might be thinking, okay, he loved to party. So what? But here's where things get interesting. Wenceslaus wasn't just a careless king, he was a dangerous one. When he drank, his temper became notorious. He had a habit of imprisoning or even torturing members of his court when they disagreed with him. One historian tells of an incident where Wenceslaus personally beat a judge for a ruling he didn't like. And by beat, I don't mean a stern lecture, I mean he dragged the poor man into the castle and attacked him. Medieval kings had absolute power, but Wenceslaus took that concept to a new, wine-soaked level. He also had a penchant for turning his court into a kind of bizarre dance hall. Instead of surrounding himself with wise advisors or respected nobles, he preferred to hang out with entertainers, gamblers, and to put it bluntly, rather dubious characters. Musicians, jesters, prostitutes, and drinking buddies held more sway at Wenceslaus's court than bishops or knights. His court was nicknamed the Tavern of Bohemia. Historians still debate whether this is somewhat of an exaggeration. Was Wenceslaus really so wild, or were his enemies simply smearing his reputation to justify rebellion? Some modern scholars argue that the stories of his debauchery were political propaganda. Others point to the constant records of royal absences, drunken arrests, and canceled meetings as evidence that the rumors were at least partly true. One of the most scandalous events of his reign occurred in 1393 when he ordered the torture and drowning of a priest named John of Nepomuk in the Vltava River. Why? Well, the details remain murky. Some say that John refused to reveal the Queen's confession. Others say it was part of a political feud with the church. Whatever the case, Wenceslaus didn't just order the murder, he reportedly took personal pleasure in seeing it happen. John of Nepomuk was later canonized, and his statue still stands on Charles Bridge in Prague. Tourists touch it for good luck, perhaps unaware that the man responsible for his death was the king who ruled the nearby castle. And let's not forget Wenceslas's contributions to architecture and the arts. He had grand plans to make Prague the cultural capital of Europe. He loved manuscripts, illustrated texts, and golden chalices. He commissioned works of art that outshone those of other kingdoms, but the problem was, he often lost interest halfway through. Projects would be started, then stalled. Churches would be abandoned while the king went hunting or drinking. Meanwhile, the kingdom of Bohemia was in chaos. The nobility was angry. The church was outraged. The common people didn't know whether to laugh or cry. And by 1400, things had gotten so bad that Wenceslas was actually deposed as King of the Holy Romans, a title he held in addition to the Bohemian crown. His political opponents declared him unfit to rule on the grounds of his personal conduct. Frankly, they were right. But this is where the story of Wenceslas gets strange again. Even after losing his crown, he remained on the throne of Bohemia. Somehow, through a combination of charm, bribery, and unpredictability, he managed to keep it. It was as if the nobility couldn't decide whether to overthrow him or let him drink himself into retirement. Later, Wenceslas became more reclusive. He retreated to hunting lodges, surrounded by animals, jesters, and according to some sources, a suspicious number of not entirely political companions. He kept exotic pets, including lions and leopards, and sometimes let them roam free in the palace. Imagine attending a royal meeting while a leopard slept under the table. That's medieval leadership, Bohemian style. By the time of his death in 1419, Wenceslas had become a legend in his own lifetime. Some saw him as a tragic figure, a man crushed by the burden of expectation, seeking security and pleasure. Others saw him as a dangerous fool who let his kingdom fall while chasing the next glass of wine. Either way, he left behind a kingdom in turmoil. His death sparked the Hussite Wars, a series of religious conflicts that tore Bohemia apart for decades. But that's a story for another night. As you sink deeper into relaxation, think of Wenceslas not just as a king who loved wine and women, but as a symbol of how individual frailties can spill over and shape the fate of nations. Sometimes history isn't made by generals or prophets. It's made by men who forget their duty for a jar of mead. You might think that after Wenceslas IV, royal fraud could not get any worse. But let's lift the veil on another king whose scandals have echoed down the centuries, Charles II of Navarre, his nickname, Charles the Bad. And this time, it's not unfair. Imagine a king so notorious that historians don't even bother to be subtle. They don't call him Charles the Complicated or Charles the Controversial. No, just bad. Get straight to the point. Charles ruled Navarre, a small but strategically important kingdom located between modern-day France and Spain in the mid-1300s. But don't let the size of his empire fool you. Charles played a dangerous game of international politics, and his personal life was as chaotic as his diplomatic schemes. If Game of Thrones had a character based on him, the writers would have toned down the authenticity for the sake of clarity. When he ascended the throne in 1349, Charles showed a remarkable talent for treachery from the very beginning. He was charming, learned, and fluent in many languages, but beneath his gentle exterior was a soul obsessed with revenge, sex, and destruction. One historian called him the most shameless prince of all time. But tonight's story isn't just about politics. It's also about Charles's personal life, the part that makes him a perfect addition to our collection of medieval mischief makers. First, let's talk about his tastes. Charles was notoriously promiscuous, and unlike Edward II or Wenceslas, he made no secret of it. He didn't just seduce women with courtly love poems. He actively pursued the wives and daughters of nobles. Some historians have even suggested that he used his political power to coerce women into private meetings, a gentle medieval euphemism for something far less consensual. At one point, Charles is said to have kept a rotating cast of mistresses in castles across his domain. Locals have told of orgies, secret tunnels, and masquerade balls where anything could happen, though historians still debate whether these stories are exaggerated or just Thursday nights in Navarre. One particularly infamous incident involved Charles kidnapping the daughter of a powerful noble who had offended him politically. Instead of ransoming her, Charles married her off to one of his henchmen, effectively ruining her social prospects and dishonoring her family. Some documents suggest that the kidnapping was not just political but personal. But Charles's love life wasn't his only pastime. He had a taste for torture that other medieval kings seemed mild. In one notorious case, Charles allegedly punished a courtier by locking him in a barrel, pouring honey over him, and leaving him to be devoured by insects. Was that justice, or just creative stress relief? Scholars still debate this. And then there was poisoning. Charles was very fond of it, not just in theory, but in practice. He was suspected of poisoning his enemies, rivals, and possibly even his own family. He kept his own alchemists and apothecaries on hand, not to make cures, but to make secret potions. When a royal to-do list includes kiss babies, give feasts, mix arsenic, you're in a different class of medieval leader. The biggest irony, Charles the Bad himself was obsessed with his health. He consulted doctors constantly, asked for the best remedies, and used all sorts of strange elixirs to prolong his life. He even drank powdered gold, believing it would make him immortal. Spoiler alert, it didn't. His obsession with death became so extreme that he slept in special rooms designed to keep out poison and assassins. His meals were tasted by his servants, and he once ordered a nobleman to switch beds with him in case someone poisoned the mattress. Could a mattress be poisoned? Well, in medieval Navarre, you weren't allowed to take any chances. But in the end, Charles's death was even stranger than any assassination attempt. According to historians, when he was old and frail, his doctors suggested a strange treatment. They wrapped him from head to toe in linen, soaked in brandy to enhance his temper. Unfortunately, the nurse assigned to close the linen made a fatal mistake. She used a candle to finish the stitches. The alcohol ignited, literally turning Charles the Bad into a living torch. He died in agony, proving that karma sometimes waits until the final chapter. Even in death, Charles left behind chaos. His kingdom fell into chaos. His descendants inherited his enemies, and his legend grew. Some peasants believe he haunts the castles of Navarre like a ghost coiled in flames. Others say his spirit wanders the Pyrenees, still plotting from the dead. Historians still debate Charles's true nature. Was he a product of his times, a ruthless ruler in a ruthless age, or was he really worse than his contemporaries? A villain whose personal vices contributed to his political tyranny. No one can say for sure, but his life teaches us a strange thing about power. It magnifies everything, good and bad, and in Charles's case, it mostly magnifies the bad. So, as you get cozy under the covers, imagine this: a medieval king pacing his wine-scented room, plotting his revenge while his alchemist stirs something suspicious over the fire. Outside, torches flicker, courtiers whisper, and somewhere in the distance, a nurse fumbles with a needle and a candle. Good night. Now, just when you thought you'd reached the pinnacle of royal debauchery, let's delve deeper into the shadows of medieval opulence, greed, and yes, unabashed pleasure-seeking. Because not every infamous king was defined by violence or political intrigue. Some, like Alfonso XI of Castile, preferred to rule from the bedroom. Alfonso XI lived in the early 1300s, ruling Castile and Leon, two major kingdoms in modern-day Spain. He was fierce in battle, yes, and even commanded troops during the Reconquista, the long campaign to drive Muslim rulers from Iberia. On the battlefield, he was known as the Avenger of the Cross. But back home, suppose he had other interests. Historians might have called him the Avenger of the Bedsheets. Of course, Alfonso had a legitimate wife, Maria of Portugal. Royal marriages in the 14th century weren't about love, they were about politics. And unfortunately for Maria, Alfonso didn't care about saving face. He publicly rejected her in favor of another woman, Leonor de Guzman, his favorite mistress. The term mistress is significant here, because Leonor wasn't just a passing fling, she was practically a co-ruler. Alfonso made no effort to hide the affair. He paraded Leonor at court ceremonies, seated her next to him at banquets, and bestowed titles, lands, and power on her. She bore him 10 children, yes, 10, while his real queen sat on the sidelines, humiliated. One historian described Leonor as a queen of darkness, and not just metaphorically. She actually stood next to the king while his wife was pushed to the back of the room. Now, you might be thinking, okay, medieval kings had mistresses all the time. True, but Alfonso's relationship with Leonor was so public, so scandalous, that it caused political chaos across the Iberian Peninsula. Her family wielded enormous power, which angered other nobles. Tensions erupted into civil war more than once, all because the king was unable or unwilling to keep his private life private. Worse still, Alfonso used the kingdom's treasury to finance his amorous adventures. He built Leonor lavish palaces, gave her queenly estates, and lavished her family with privileges. Some towns in Castile actually had to double their taxes to cover the cost of Alfonso's bedchamber. Imagine paying medieval rent, knowing that part of it would be used to buy silk sheets for the king's mistress. How unfair. But the strangest detail, Alfonso didn't just give Leonor her fortune. He rewrote the laws of inheritance so that her illegitimate children would inherit royal rights. This caused a terrible headache for the Castilian nobility, because it blurred the line between legitimate and illegitimate heirs. The church objected, the queen's allies objected, but Alfonso, he didn't care. His personal life came first, politics second. One historian likened his court to a circus, an endless parade of favors, flattery, and family squabbles over who would get into the king's private chambers. And in those chambers, Alfonso's depravity became legendary. Wine flowed like rivers, musicians played day and night, servants talked of secret midnight parties where the only rule was debauchery. Historians still debate whether Alfonso's obsession with pleasure was an escape from the pressures of kingship or simply a reflection of his nature. Was he escaping the brutal realities of medieval warfare, or was he simply a man who preferred velvet cloaks and soft pillows to chainmail and cold iron? No one knows for sure. Despite his scandalous personal life, however, Alfonso was not a useless king. He led military campaigns, and in 1340 he won a decisive victory at the Battle of Rio Salado, repelling invading forces from North Africa. For this, he earned the respect of other Christian kings, but even on campaign, Alfonso always took Leonor with him, setting up temporary palaces near the battlefield. One can imagine him sitting in a military tent, directing war strategy in the morning and hosting private parties at night. His soldiers slept in mud. Alfonso slept on velvet cushions. Unfortunately, even kings could not escape death, although Alfonso's was not exactly a noble one. He died in 1350 during the Black Death, the same plague that killed millions across Europe. Some say his reckless lifestyle ruined his health. Others say it was simply bad luck. Either way, his death left a mess. Queen Maria of Portugal took brutal revenge on Leonor de Guzman, ordering her arrest and eventual execution. The Dark Queen was no more. But the legacy of Alfonso's indulgence remained. His children, both legitimate and illegitimate, spent decades fighting for power. His favoritism created political rifts that would ripple through Spain for generations. Yet Alfonso XI remains one of the least known of the kings, perhaps because his crimes were so human. He was no torturer like Charles the Bad, nor did he burn himself in brandy-soaked bandages. He was simply a man who loved pleasure more than politics, silk more than steel, and personal passion more than public duty. As you sink deeper into your pillow tonight, imagine this: a marble hall shimmering with candlelight, a feast that never ends, music that never stops. Somewhere, in the shadows of history, Alfonso XI still lies stretched out on his velvet couch, wine in one hand, Leonor in the other, ignoring the cold wind of war just outside his window. Your eyes are heavy now, but there's one more royal scandal to consider before bed. How about this one? It's a strange mix of medieval superstition, loneliness, and, creepy behavior. Meet Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, a king whose reign was rife with bizarre obsessions, private dungeons, and what some might politely call unusual hobbies. Wenceslaus was born in 1361, the son of the mighty emperor Charles IV. He inherited the throne of Bohemia at the age of 17 and was named King of the Romans, a flashy title for someone expected to become the next Holy Roman Emperor. Sounds impressive. Right, except Wenceslaus wasn't exactly cut out for the job. He was erratic, impulsive, and notoriously lazy when it came to actual governing. Instead of attending royal councils or improving the lives of his subjects, Wenceslaus holed himself up in Prague Castle, pursuing hobbies that made even his closest advisors uneasy. One of his favorite pastimes: collecting rare animals, not in the royal zoo like other kings, but in his own private chambers. Peacocks strutted across the marble floors, monkeys perched on the velvet curtains. And, according to one historian, Wenceslaus loved to sleep with his favorite hunting dogs curled up next to him in bed. Dogs are great, of course, but perhaps not when you're supposed to be running an empire. But the weirdness doesn't stop there. Wenceslaus dabbled in astrology and alchemy, which were common in medieval Europe. What wasn't common, taking prisoners to participate in his experiments. It is said that he locked scholars and astrologers in dark towers, demanding that they create potions or predict the future. If they failed, well, let's just say that the royal dungeons in Prague were not known for their comfort. One famous story tells of Wenceslaus tying a scholar to a chair for 3 days straight, not allowing him to sleep until he saw visions. Whether those visions were the result of prophecy or lack of sleep is a matter of debate. And then there was the matter of his personal pleasures. Wenceslaus had no interest in politics, but he was fond of food, wine, and yes, carnal pleasures. Prague became notorious for its royal banquets that lasted for days, sometimes weeks. Servants staggered out of the great halls, carrying trays of half-eaten pastries while exhausted minstrels. At these parties, Wenceslaus often dressed in strange costumes, sometimes as a peasant, sometimes as an animal mask. He wandered among the guests, whispering odd questions like, "What do you think dreams are made of?" or "Do you think the stars are watching over us right now?" This was hardly a normal dinner conversation. Modern historians still debate whether Wenceslaus was mentally ill or simply eccentric. Some say he suffered from severe depression, made worse by political tensions and personal isolation. Others believe he simply refused to live up to royal expectations and decided to build his own strange world within the castle walls. And the political consequences predictably disastrous. The nobility grew tired of his inaction. Enemies circled Bohemia like vultures. The Pope of the time even wrote to Wenceslaus begging him to get out of bed and rule. But the king preferred his own bizarre rituals, feeding grapes to monkeys, gazing at the stars, and surrounding himself with scholars who promised to uncover the secrets of the universe. In 1394, things came to a head. A group of nobles kidnapped Wenceslaus during one of his vacations in the woods. They dragged him back to Prague and forced him to sign papers that limited his powers. Wenceslaus reacted the only way he knew how. He sulked in his room for months, refusing to speak to anyone but his livestock. Later, when he was finally restored to some of his royal duties, he spent more time brewing exotic herbal teas than actually ruling the kingdom. One historian claims that Wenceslaus carried a bag of dried herbs with him everywhere, believing that it could ward off evil spirits or at least nightmares. There's even a story about Wenceslaus wandering the streets of Prague at night in disguise, listening to the gossip of the common people. Some say he used this information to punish those who spoke ill of him. Others say he simply preferred to hear what the world really thought of him, avoiding the polite lies of the court. Eventually, the empire had had enough. In 1400, the German princes formally deposed Wenceslaus as King of the Holy Romans. They declared him unfit to rule, citing his dereliction of duty and disgraceful conduct. But Wenceslaus shrugged it all off, returned to Prague, and continued to live in his eccentric world. He died quietly in 1419, sitting in his favorite chair at his hunting lodge, possibly of a heart attack. Some say his dogs remained by his side, as they always had. Was Wenceslaus IV a mad king, a misunderstood philosopher, or just a man who avoided reality because it was too heavy? Historians are still debating his legacy, but one thing is certain. He remains one of the most unusual kings of the Middle Ages, a ruler more interested in dreams and entertainment than power or conquest. As you sink deeper into your pillow, imagine the soft footsteps in the castle corridors, the rustle of silken robes in the moonlight, and a lonely king whispering to his pet monkey while the world goes on without him. And now, your journey through the strange corridors of royal history will lead you to the final chapter of tonight's story. But don't expect it to be peaceful just yet, because the last king on your list is perhaps the most notorious. Welcome to the world of Charles II of Spain, also known as the Witch King. His story is about more than just depravity in the conventional sense. It's about what happens when centuries of royal incest lead to a king so physically and mentally weak that his very existence becomes a cautionary tale whispered in history books. Picture this. It's Madrid in the late 1600s. The The royal palace is a maze of black velvet curtains, flickering candles, and priests mumbling prayers against evil spirits. At the center of it all sat King Charles II, a gaunt, pale man with teeth so misshapen that he couldn't chew his food properly. His tongue was too big for his mouth, his limbs trembled, his eyes couldn't focus properly. One might have thought he was a ghost, except that ghosts are generally in better health. Charles was the last king of the Spanish Habsburgs, a dynasty famous for keeping the royal bloodline pure. Unfortunately, this meant generations of marriages between cousins, nieces, and even uncles and nieces. The family tree didn't branch out, it looped back. When Charles was born in 1661, he was essentially a genetic copy of a copy of a copy, smeared, faded, and not quite functioning. He couldn't speak clearly until he was 4. He didn't walk until he was 8. By adulthood, his body was so frail that he suffered from spontaneous nosebleeds from stress. The court physicians wrote privately that he looked more like a walking corpse than a king. But what was the real horror? The court still hoped he would produce an heir. Charles married twice, first to Marie-Louise of Orleans, a French princess who had come to Spain with great hope and beauty, only to find herself trapped in a castle with a husband who could not consummate the marriage. She wrote desperate letters home, describing Charles as kind but impotent. Some modern historians believe he was severely infertile due to a genetic disorder. Others believe he was simply too weak to handle the responsibilities of a husband. In any case, the marriage remained childless, and Marie-Louise died young, supposedly of grief or perhaps just relief. His second wife, Mariana of Neuburg, fared no better. She tried everything to produce an heir: prayers, potions, fasting, fertility rituals, and so on. Some nights, the royal bedroom transformed into a bizarre mix of Catholic ritual and medieval superstition. Priests sprinkled holy water on the sheets while palace alchemists whispered formulas into jars of oil. They even tried giving Charles an aphrodisiac made from powdered deer velvet and rhinoceros horn, but nothing worked. The Spanish court now believed Charles was cursed. They blamed witches, they blamed the devil, they blamed the Moors, the Jews, and anyone who wasn't a Catholic noble. Exorcisms became part of the king's daily routine. Monks were invited to chant at his bedside. He wore relics sewn into his clothes. Every convulsion, every fainting spell was taken as evidence of black magic. Historians today largely blame the inbreeding of the Habsburg dynasty, but in the candlelit paranoia of 17th century Spain, people genuinely believed that Charles was under a spell. His physical health was not the only problem. Mentally, he was like a frightened child trapped in the body of a king. He rarely made decisions for himself, relying instead on a rotating cast of advisors and conspirators. Some manipulated him for political gain. Others used him as a puppet in the wars of religion. Meanwhile, Spain was in decline, economically bankrupt, militarily weak, and politically unstable. Yet amid it all, Charles had his own strange obsessions. He loved funerals. Yes, funerals. Whenever a noble died, Charles insisted on attending the embalming ceremony. He loved to watch the bodies being prepared for burial. Sometimes he even ordered the exhumation of royal ancestors so he could examine their remains. It is said that he spent hours in the royal crypt, staring at the bones by candlelight, muttering prayers and asking for advice from his ancestors. Was this a spiritual devotion, or was it simply a king obsessed with death because he himself was near? Some scholars suggest both. By his late 30s, a ripe age for Charles, he looked twice as old. His hair was falling out, his teeth were rotten. He suffered from epilepsy and stomach ulcers. He weighed less than 100 pounds. Yet the court still demanded that he have children. His failure to produce an heir led to one of the most devastating wars in European history, the War of the Spanish Succession. When Charles died in 1700, childless and exhausted, he left behind a political vacuum so vast that it drew in nations from across Europe. France, Austria, England all went to war to claim his throne. But what about Charles's personal life? It was a battleground long before the cannons. Today, historians study his reign as an example of royal tragedy, a man trapped by birth, biology, and superstition, a king whose personal life, fearful, helpless, and morbidly preoccupied with death, led directly to the downfall of an empire. As you sink deeper into your pillow, imagine Charles wandering the royal crypt beneath the Escorial Palace. candle in hand, asking the skulls for advice on matters of state. The marble is cold beneath his feet. The silence was heavy, and somewhere in the darkness, history turned a new page.